today's event, we kick off our annual Brown Bag Summer School Series. This is the first of 7. I'll turn it over to Sandy Nichols, who is our senior attorney here at Environmental Law Institute. She's also the Assistant Director of Judicial Training and the Co-Director of our Africa program.
Thank you very much, Chandra. It's fun to be here, and I'm looking forward to an interesting discussion today. We're lucky to have a great panel. To my immediate left is Laura Cantral. She's a partner at the Meridian Institute. Next I have Brendan Harrell, who's an associate at Beveridge and Diamond. After him is Juge Gregg from the Environment and Natural Resources Division of the Department of Justice. Then we have Mary Morningstar, who's Associate General Counsel focusing on environmental law at Lockheed Martin Corporation. And finally we have Dan Schramm, who's an attorney advisor at the EPA. So, Laura, if you'd like to go ahead and get started.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been really looking forward to this discussion, and I'm going to keep my remarks really brief because there's several of us, and I think the idea is for this to be interactive and have questions and a dialogue. So I'll keep my remarks brief. When we got on the phone a few weeks ago to get ourselves organized, and at that point agreed that it made sense to go alphabetically, so that meant that I went first. What might not make as much sense about me going first is I, of all of these distinguished colleagues here, am the non-traditional. I think I have a law degree. I am not practicing law in a firm or in an agency. I work for a nonprofit organization called Meridian Institute. We have several offices. Our DC office is actually right across the street, so it took me about 2 minutes to walk over here. We are in the mission of our organization is to bring collaborative problem solving tools to tough societal issues. So we do mediations and negotiations, meeting facilitation, other kind of collaborative process design and implementation for public policy issues or other kind of tough societal issues. So not private negotiations or mediations between private parties. I am someone who went to, so just a couple of words about how I got there, and then you can hear some stories from my fellow panelists. I went to law school at the University of Mississippi. That's where I grew up, in Mississippi. So I went to the state law school, which is a great law school with a pretty traditional approach to raise up young lawyers to practice law in the state of Mississippi in a traditional sense, in a law firm or a state agency or other kinds of opportunities. That was not the career path that I was most interested in. I was someone who wanted to do, for those of you who are either in law school or thinking about going to law school or have been to law school, one of the other things you can do with a law degree, that was what I was interested in exploring. Not as easy to do in a small state at a state university that's pretty used to the traditional career path. But I was fortunate to be able to get a position after graduating from law school with the National Sea Grant College program, which does a lot of research and advisory work, much of it focused on science or extension work related to people who are involved in ocean and coastal management. But there are a few programs that focus on the law and policy of oceans and coasts and management of those resources. So that put me on a trajectory of recognizing that ocean policy was something that I was really interested in. The intersection of law and policy and politics is the space that I wanted to be in. And through some chain of events that we could talk about more later, I found out that a more collaborative problem-solving approach, and as opposed to an adversarial problem-solving approach, was the right fit for me. So that's why I'm at Meridian, trying to apply those skills and bring the value of collaborative problem-solving where it makes sense, and it doesn't always make sense, to policy issues. So I'll leave it at that and look forward to talking about it some more.
Thanks, Laura. Go ahead, Brendan.
Hi, everyone. My name is Brandon Harrell, and I want to thank you for for having me today. I'm a second-year associate at Beveridge and Diamond. And for those of you that are not familiar with Beveridge and Diamond, it's a law firm. We're located here in DC, and we have 6 offices throughout the country. We have approximately 100 attorneys and are known for our environmental practice. Environmental law is what we primarily do. A little about my background, I do environmental litigation at Beveridge and Diamond. Also done some regulatory work. We primarily do litigation, environmental litigation, regulatory work, and we do some environmental transactional work and land use work. Prior to starting at Beveridge and Diamond, I came straight from law school to Beveridge and Diamond, so I've only been out for practicing for about 2 years, and before that I summered at the EPA in their Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance, and before that I summered at the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. So primarily environmental law is sort of what I knew I wanted to do that while in law school. I went to Tulane in New Orleans and was a member of the Environmental Law Clinic, part of the Environmental Law Society, and did a lot of good environmental work down there as well. And then before that, I have a background in chemical engineering, which I majored in undergrad. So I sort of knew the path that I wanted to take. And for those of you, and we can get to this later, but I know some people always ask, what should I be doing in law school at this point in time, or if I want to go into a career, have a career in environmental law. And we can talk about this later, but you want to, kind of show a demonstrated interest in that area. And, it's one thing I strive to do in law school. And I think others on the panel may say that, that's some things people look at when they're hiring or looking to bring in students, but we can continue that later. So that's a little snippet of my background, and I'm happy to be here.
Thank you all for coming. I'm Juge Gregg at the U.S. Department of Justice in the Environment and Natural Resources Division of the Department of Justice, and in the Law and Policy section of the Environment Division. And I suppose I should give the traditional preface that the remarks you're about to hear do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of the Department of Justice, but the Law and Policy section of the Environment Division has a number of different sections that do various pieces of work. There's the Environmental Enforcement section, which does, not surprisingly, environmental enforcement. There's Environmental Defense, which defends the government on environmental issues. There's the Indian Resources section. There's the Wildlife section, and there's land acquisition. The Law and Policy section deals with sort of the intersection of all of those different sections. We deal with either changes in laws or changes in regulations that will impact the work that the Environment Division does. We also get involved we have an active amicus litigation practice where, once again, we get involved in cases that may impact the work that may have particular interest to or cross-cutting issues for the division. We also do a number of the nuts and bolts things for the Environment Division, the FOIA work as well as the ethics work. And so it's a great place to work if you like not knowing what you're going to be working on when you get up in the morning, which is sort of where I'm coming from. Laura said that she may represent the non-traditional path. I maybe represent the traditional path, but unfortunately, or fortunately for me, its traditional paths various. I haven't settled on the particular path. I only recently joined DOJ. Prior to that, or actually coming out of law school, I spent a couple of years in Portland, Oregon, practicing with Perkins Coie, doing primarily Clean Water Act work. And then we moved back here to DC, and I spent a couple of years doing consulting and focused on international environmental policy work. Worked as a senior campaigner for the Environmental Investigation Agency, which is an organization that investigates international environmental crime and uses the results of that investigation to try and leverage change. Then I rejoined private practice and spent about 6 years at Sidley Austin in their environmental group, doing a range of both environmental litigation as well as compliance counseling, civil, criminal, appellate, and then am now just recently at Department of Justice. So there are a variety of different traditional career tracks that I can speak to at least a little bit as we go forward.
Well, I wish I could say that like Laura and Brandon and Juge, that I had an idea what I wanted to do when I was in law school. I thought what I wanted to do was women's and civil rights. That was really my first love. But most of you are way too young to remember this, but I graduated from law school in 1984 with an offer from the EEOC, and it was the middle of the Reagan years, and he cut the department, and I lost my offer. So I moved to D.C. I went to Case Western Reserve Law School in Cleveland. I moved to D.C. with no job, which is not a very smart thing to do when you go to a school outside of D.C. that's a Tier 2 school. So I had to just basically bust my ass doing a bunch of different things to pay the rent, and eventually got a job with an environmental consulting firm as a regulatory analyst, because they figured, well, we wanted to pay you as much as a lawyer, even though I by then passed the bar, but maybe you've got a good mind because you did go to law school. So I figured, well, what the heck, it's a job, so I took it. But it's been a great career for me, and I was lucky enough to in 1989 meet my now husband. But the unlucky part was he was in the military stationed in Las Vegas, Nevada, which is, no offense to people who like Nevada, is not a very fun place to live. But Lockheed Corporation back at the time, for some reason, had its environmental safety and health office in Las Vegas. I didn't want to take the Nevada bar. I'd only been a member of the bar for 5 years. And I got a job there, basically running their regulatory compliance group. And at that point, Lockheed was a little small airplane company, and they really had a lot of environmental issues that needed to be fixed. I became an expert on Superfund. We, to this day, are cleaning up 62 sites nationwide. We're a company made up of about 100 other companies, all of which started to manufacture stuff back in the early 1900s before most environmental laws, well, all environmental laws were passed. So the good thing I can say about working for Lockheed Martin, as I said to actually Dan when we were starting, if somebody had told me that I would be working for a defense contractor for 23 years when I was 21 years old in 1984, I would have said they were crazy. But the best thing about working for this company is we actually, from an environmental safety and health perspective, we do the right thing. It's not just a line. It's an actual truth. I was on the phone with a colleague of mine from another company I won't name, and he asked me how many lawyers at DOJ I deal with, and I said, none. He was like, what are you talking about? What about all your enforcement actions? I said, they're pretty small, and we resolve them and pay the fine when we get them, and our job is to get as few NOVs a year, notices of violation a year as possible. I spend probably 80% of my days working mostly on historical issues, Superfund cleanups, the very little bit of litigation, thank God, that we get related to those cleanups. And sorry for the people on the phone, I was knocking on wood. So we don't really have huge compliance problems. We have a huge Go Green program that we've been awarded for, believe it or not. So there's kind of a perception, not amongst my government colleagues actually, and not even among the more sophisticated environmental groups. And we've been a member of ELI for almost 20 years. But among some people who just don't understand, they think because it's a defense contractor, ergo, from an environmental perspective, it must be bad. And that's actually not true, at least with my company. I can tell you that from an environmental perspective, I'm very proud to say that we go out ahead of the game to try to figure out if there's contamination, where it is, and the best way to clean it up. I've never heard anybody up to the board level say, why are you spending all that money? Seriously. Seems hard to believe, I know, for people who don't understand the business, but I can tell you, I'm sure Dan believes it, and I bet you believe it. So I'm happy to answer questions. I took a very untraditional path in some respects, but I'm lucky that now at the age of almost 54, I love what I do, and I can actually see retiring from this company, which again, I never thought I'd say. But I did this 2 years ago and had a great time, and the best part, not just because of the wine, but because of the conversation, was the reception afterwards, because I really had an opportunity to talk to a lot of folks, and I maybe even 2 years ago talked to you, Brandon, and I'm happy to do that. So I will shut up now, and you can hear from folks who have a better career path in some respects than mine, but I'm happy and looking forward to your questions and to talking to you at the reception.
Well, thanks, and just to repeat what everybody else said, it's a real honor and pleasure to be here. It's a lot of fun to do this, and I'm glad you all could make it. My name's Dan Schramm. I'm at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. I'm in the Office of General Counsel there. One of the things that's great about this panel, and I think y'all did a really good job of putting it together because we have a lot of very diverse paths. One of the things I also noticed, we have a lot of diversity in terms of where folks are in their careers.
Are you talking about young Brandon versus old me?
I didn't say that. I didn't say that. Well, so where I guess where I fit into that matrix is I'm about 5 years, going on 5 years out of law school. I went to Vermont Law School, graduated in 2008, spent 2 years out of law school at the Environmental Law Institute. Good to be back. And we talk a little bit more about that. And then from there, moved to the Office of General Counsel at EPA, where I've been for going on 3 years. So my path, I knew I wanted to do environmental work when I was in college. And in fact, I even, my mantra was, I said, I want to be an environmentalist first and a lawyer second. So that's why one of the reasons I gravitated towards Vermont Law School, because of their environmental specialty. And there are a few other schools around, of course, that do have very good environmental programs. And more it seems like that's becoming a key part of the legal curriculum. So, at Vermont, let's see, what did I do? I did the environmental law clinic there, which was mostly litigation focused at the time. We were doing a Resource Conservation and Recovery Act citizen suit, which on a mining case in Vermont. So got some litigation experience, mostly discovery experience there. Spent my one summer at the Southern Environmental Law Center, which is a Southern Regional Environmental group, very well respected, I think, kind of across all the sectors. And then I did a semester actually at the Department of Justice, right down the hall from where Juge is at the appellate section, where they mostly had me writing very minor, short procedural motions, but it was very interesting nonetheless. Great experience actually. So, just a little bit about what I do at General Counsel's office. Y'all are on the right track because y'all are here and you're all learning about what these different careers involve, and the diversity of opportunities in the legal profession is just immense. And I have to admit, I think and a lot of folks probably going to law school just having no clue, what does a lawyer do exactly in the first place? I mean, you sort of see caricatures of lawyers in the popular culture, and oftentimes the day-to-day is so very different than that. So,
although my cousin Vinny is very real.
I've heard Law and Order is too.
Yeah, that's.
I'm actually waiting for an environmental law drama, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure that can be done, but it could work. I don't know.
Civil action.
Yeah.
Yeah, civil action. That's right. Well, there you go. It's been done. TV show. At OGC, we call it OGC, Office of General Counsel at EPA. We're in-house counsel for the agency, so that's similar to an in-house counsel for a corporation. We generally do most of the day-to-day counseling for we refer to them as our program clients. So we actually think of ourselves as in a client relationship with the program offices of the agency, and all of that kind of comes along with that. So we can communicate with them under an attorney-client privilege, for example, or represent them to other federal agencies, to state agencies, to people outside of the government, and even to the Justice Department. Justice Department acts as counsel for the entire federal government, and as you might imagine, that's a pretty hefty job, and there's a lot of components of the federal government. So all the different components, most if not all of them, have their own general counsel's office or equivalent. They might be called chief counsel, or a DOI, the Department of Interior, it's the solicitor, and so that's where a large amount of the cadre of federal lawyers will be found. They're not just the DOJ folks. DOJ more in the role of the litigator, although that obviously with where Juge is at, it's sort of an interesting hybrid, I think. So so that's just my sort of day-to-day life is spent mostly working with the clients in the agency, helping them understand what their obligations are under the law, just like Mary does with her clients in Lockheed Martin. So that that doesn't always make us the best loved people in the agency, because even the government has to obey the law. So that's a lot of what we do.
Thank you so much, Dan. I'll take a moment just to give you a little background about myself, and then we'll turn to questions and discussion. Similar to Dan, I always knew I wanted to do environmental work. I was sort of an outdoor kid and kind of had naturalist tendencies, and I was looking for how I could make an impact. And after college, well, I majored in earth and environmental science, and after college I was casting around for what I might do, and I ended up getting an internship at the Environmental Law Institute, which really dictated what my choices later. After that, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in the Ivory Coast, working on urban environmental issues, and then I went to law school at the University of Virginia that has a very small environmental program, but it was actually, in a way, that worked out to the benefit of those of us who are interested, because it was pretty easy to get involved. And my first job out of law school, I was very lucky. I knew I wanted to do public interest work, and I was able to get a job litigating with a very small nonprofit environmental litigation organization that no longer exists, but that was based in Montgomery, Alabama. And at the time, we were the only group based in Alabama. Some other groups did some work there, but we were the only public interest environmental group based in Alabama. So we got all kinds of issues, and so I had a lot of fun learning about what a lawyer does, but getting to address the whole range of different types of issues and work with a lot of different clients. And after that, I decided that I wanted to really have the chance to kind of dig my teeth into problems in greater detail and do analysis and try to contribute to advancing the field. So I came back to ELI in 2006. And at first, I spent about a year focusing mostly on domestic issues and doing kind of ELI's bread and butter work of 50-state studies and kind of more technical analyses of state and federal laws, basically. Now I'm doing more of a combination between research and analysis and educational programs. Chandra mentioned I'm a deputy director of the judicial training program, which is a really fun niche to be in. It's pretty incredible to go to a country and provide information to judges about laws that they've never even seen before. They don't have copies of environmental laws. They're not familiar with the concepts at all, but they know from their daily lives that the issues are important. And then otherwise I work on some forestry issues, some marine governance issues, and been focusing on looking at natural resources management and peace building. So that's my 2 cents about myself, and I'd like to throw it back to the panel. I think some of you touched on this a little bit, but I think we've got a good sense of the arc of your careers, but it would be nice to have a little more detail. I don't know if it makes more sense for each of you to talk about one day or 1 week, but if each of you could just go into a little more detail about how you really spend your time.
So maybe
start,
start
yeah.
the-
Oh, okay.
start down
Yeah. That's fine.
Fair is fair. That's a great question, actually. So the Office of General Counsel is broken up into several different components. There's the media law offices, and then there's the a cross-cutting law office. We actually have intellectual property lawyers at EPA. Sometimes our scientists actually invent something that there's actually rights that are associated with that. We have employment lawyers. We have lawyers that do everything that you would need to do general corporate counsel for any organization, and particularly one as complex as EPA. The media law offices, which is sort of where the sort of traditional or conventional environmental law gets done, that you all probably are familiar or have in your heads when you think about environmental law, things like the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, Superfund, TSCA, FIFRA, and Oil Pollution Act, a couple of other media statutes. Those are the statutes that EPA has primary responsibility for, and the General Counsel's Law Office is divided up so that I'm in the Solid Waste and Emergency Response Law Office, which was one of the media offices, and generally works on hazardous waste, solid waste, Superfund sites, Oil Pollution Act, and Clean Water Act 311, which is kind of similar to the Oil Pollution Act, deals with releases to waters in the United States. And there's an air law office, which is like 3 or 4 times bigger than our law office, because the Clean Air Act, as you can imagine, generates a ton of legal issues and litigation. And then there's a water law office, and then there's a law office we call PITSLO, Pesticides and Toxics, which does FIFRA and TSCA together. So that's how, I think that might be helpful to have a sense of what EPA does. Of course, there's a ton of environmental law that happens in the other federal agencies, particularly under Department of Interior and others. My day-to-day is really, I'll kind of relate what I first started doing at EPA. When I came there, the attorney that was doing brownfields law was going on maternity leave. Brownfields is sort of a special subsection of Superfund law that deals with cleaning up low-risk sites or sites that have not been put on the Superfund list, sites where redevelopment would be a big economic boon for the local community. So, when you go into government, like Juge said, you never know what you're going to get. Like, sort of first day, this attorney was like, "I'm going to be out starting in 2 weeks for 6 months. So you're going to have to learn Superfund law, and then and then be the Superfund guy for the agency for like 6 months." That was really challenging, but it was also really fun. And the OGC is a very specialized office, whereas other law offices might have more of a generalist focus, where people do lots of different things. I think our enforcement office at EPA is if there's a distinction between the two, that's one of them. That the enforcement office tends to have more generalist type attorneys who might have to handle a lot of different matters, whereas OGC, we really specialize. So that means, like, when I was doing brownfields, which was pretty much a full-time job for about 6 months, I was focused on one subsection, 104K of Superfund. So you get to know that statute very well. And the agency does that for a reason, which is that, when you have a bunch of folks who have to do all kinds of different things in their day-to-day, sometimes they need somebody to go to who's like, "I don't know anything about anything else you're doing, but I really know this section of the law." And that's the kind of counsel that OGC tries to provide, generally. So that was sort of my day-to-day experience. And what that meant was the regional offices, the EPA, sometimes people say there are 11 EPAs. There's the headquarters and there's the 10 regional offices. They have a lot of autonomy. So the regional offices are the one, also have their own legal offices, and they would be the ones that are working more closely and directly with the states, with the regulated community, with environmental groups. They're doing a lot of on-the-ground work, whereas we're sort of at this DC policy level here. But when they have issues that raise an issue of national policy or national legal significance, that's usually when the headquarters people will get called in and say, "Hey, we have this issue," and then we sort of manage it appropriately and bring in the right offices. So you don't know what that question's going to be, though. Any day it could, anything could show up. Oftentimes with brownfields, it's related to who is liable or not, which is one of the big perennial legal questions that gets litigated in environmental laws: who's liable under Superfund. Congress, in its wisdom, set up the brownfield statute so that we can provide grants, but we can only provide grants to people who are not liable. So oftentimes
we never get grants.
Yep. So it's just doing that sort of, send me the facts, I'll look at it, and I'll try and say, well, yeah, they look. It gets very complicated. So you're often in very gray areas, but we're basically trying to make an administrative determination as to liability for purposes of the grants program, because we like to keep those two things separate. But anyway, that's sort of what I was doing day to day. That's changed now. I'm actually doing a lot of other things, but that as an example of what you might be doing at the office.
Actually, Dan, you touched on a lot of things, and there are similarities in an interesting way between being an attorney for an in-house counsel for a government agency and being in-house counsel for a corporation. Lockheed Martin has 4 major business areas. We've got about 130,000 employees worldwide, although the great majority in the United States. And thank you. And there are 3 environmental safety and health lawyers full-time for that population. Thank you. We've got about 200 facilities in this country, with a small smattering in the UK, 1 in Argentina, and then basically that's it except for sales offices. And we handle kind of, in a way, like what you said, Dan, we handle the big picture things. We handle all the Superfund liability because that's a corporate headquarters liability. We've decided that we're not going to burden our businesses with that liability. And honestly, the business areas each have a set of lawyers also, all answering ultimately to my boss, the general counsel, but they don't have that level of expertise. They are day-to-day on-the-ground people. They may understand aspects of the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, et cetera, but when there are big issues, thank God they don't happen very often, they will call on one of the 3 corporate environmental safety and health lawyers. And so from a day-to-day perspective, I'm the environmental lawyer for all of our transactions. Since September 11th, we've bought about 50 companies. And I'm the lawyer who determines from an environmental safety and health perspective what the liabilities are, figure out if, the ways to minimize those liabilities, work on the transition of the company into the Lockheed Martin way, which is, we've got a number of policies and functional procedures ensuring environmental compliance and safety and health compliance. And then I'm the lawyer for about 1/3 of all of our cleanup sites. Most of the ones for which I'm the lawyer are now in what are known as operation and maintenance. We know what the contamination is. We figured it out a long time ago. We put in a treatment system. Periodically, we deal with either EPA or state agency to make sure that we're all on track. There are things called 5-year reviews and stuff like that. We deal with brownfields issues quite a bit, although we never get grants because we're the liable party. But we want to make sure that if we're selling a property to somebody that's still contaminated, 1, we remain on the hook for the liability, but 2, if they happen to need something to ensure that they can get the right permitting, et cetera, to run it, that we help them go through the brownfields grant process. And then, we do have every once in a while the problems. We dealt with our Texas facility where we make big aircraft, but was operating under a flex permit in the state of Texas, and EPA didn't really like the way the program was working, so we negotiated a better permit arrangement that would make both EPA and the state of Texas environmental agency happy. But those things don't
That
really.
would be hard.
Yeah, it was. No, it actually worked. It actually worked out all right. It did. Right now, we're working with the new aerospace NEPA, which is a national emissions standard for hazardous air pollutants, and we were one of the 3 companies chosen to do a tremendous amount of testing at our 3 major aeronautics facilities, which are one's in Georgia, one's in Texas, and one's in California. And we are working with EPA out of Research Triangle Park to figure out the best way to get this air-shaped NEPA in shape enough that it works and that it's feasible, that we can actually make it work but meet all the goals of the aerospace NEPA. That's, again, been a very cooperative process. It hasn't been adversarial at all. And so I'm the lawyer for that. We have a big new TSCA issue, which I find fascinating because I like TSCA, which sounds crazy when we're not a chemical company. We are really pioneering a lot of nanotechnology. For example, we're pioneering with a couple of other companies developing nano materials that can be used in windmill blades to make them as light as possible. EPA considers that a new chemical. And because we're not a traditional chemical company, TSCA is kind of a new law for that. But I had some background in TSCA back in my private practice days from 84 to 90, when there was a lot of stuff being decided under TSCA back then. TSCA passed in 1978. And now there's a bill before Congress that the late Senator Lautenberg sponsored. And that's been a really interesting issue to work with EPA on. Again, very cooperatively. I mean, it's okay, so you consider this a new chemical. Which nanoparticle is a new chemical, and is that nanoparticle a little bit different from this nanoparticle? So those 2 new chemicals. Fine, we just need to know what we need to get through from a regulatory process to make sure that our companies are going to be able to use these things without running up against some kind of an enforcement problem. So my day-to-day is, some of it's planned, most of it not particularly. You sit there and you've got a list of to-dos, and somebody calls you or sends you an email, and you're like, okay, well, I guess I'm working on this for the next couple of hours. So, But it's fascinating, and it changes over the years. This TSCA thing is just something that's come up within the past 2 to 3 years, and it's taken some time, but it's completely fascinating. I'm dealing with people at EPA with whom I hadn't dealt before, which is always fun too.
Given that the day-to-day changes from day to day, I'll take today and just do a couple of highlights that are, I think, illustrative of the way that the day-to-day goes. Started out more or less my day by finishing up taking a look at some comments or some hearing testimony that one of the agencies was going to give in a hearing that's later on this week, just to see if, from Department of Justice's standpoint, there was anything that we wanted to flag or comment on, make sure that that was coordinated with the folks who substantively handle the issues that are most related to that testimony, and provided, well, actually no feedback. We had no comment on that particular piece of testimony. But that's part of the sort of interagency process that happens to make sure that the government is speaking with one voice, and all the different parts of, or at least trying to speak with one voice. And I've also, part of my beat at the law and policy section is I handle the ethics work for the Environment Division, or I'm one of the 2 people who do that. And so those issues range from professional responsibility issues, as in, are you violating the bar rules, or there's a tricky issue that's coming up with conflicts or confidentiality, to the government ethics rules, which are as mundane as whether or not someone can accept an invitation to come to an ELI event where there's going to be potentially more than $20 worth of food, or maybe less than $20 worth of food, and whether or not the person can accept that, to much sort of bigger, grander issues about whether or not there may be an appearance issue for one of the senior folks at DOJ to be speaking at an event or working on a particular matter where at a firm where they used to work, for example, whether they should be recused from that issue or not. So, some of those issues are either one-off, answering the phone, answering the question, which I'm now finally getting to the point where, with the government ethics stuff, which was not something I had any experience in private practice before, I can actually pick up the phone and answer some of the basic questions about whether or not you can accept that book that someone handed you by looking at the dust cover and figuring out how much it's worth, for example. So that was part of today. Another part of today, related part of today, is coordinating with other folks, another person in the division, for training for our summer interns tomorrow that's going to be on the government ethics and professional responsibility requirements. Another part of today was talking with folks, gearing up for a meeting that almost had Dan and I both spending, well, not here and en route to Louisiana. Instead, I'm assuming you have colleagues that are there, and I'm going to be listening and painfully listening in on an all-day meeting on the phone. But it's an issue of the follow-up to the Gulf spill and the restoration work that's happening in the Gulf. And there are 5 different, well, more than 5, but there are 5 different federal agencies, 7 different? 6 federal agencies and 5 states that are actually members of a Gulf Coast Restoration Council. In addition, Department of Justice is not one of those agencies, but we are involved, given our role in the federal government, in those proceedings. So that's sort of substantive ongoing work that I've been involved in, and helping make sure that that's moving forward. And then, of course, here I am today. So, and I forgot one thing, which was double checking at some point this morning to see whether or not when exactly the Supreme Court is issuing its opinions, because I'm waiting for an opinion in a case that I was heavily involved in the briefing from an amicus perspective that was argued earlier this year and will be coming out in sometime in the next 2-3 weeks. And so it's not today, it's Thursdays and Mondays.
And that was like the intersection of Indian and child law?
Well, yes, exactly. Given my deep and abiding experience and long and relatively long work on environmental issues, the first case that I was working on for the federal government was one dealing with the Indian Child Welfare Act, which is basically Indian family law, which is appropriately something that the Environment Division, Environment and Natural Resources Division was working on because we have the Indian Resources section. And the Indian Resources section does a lot of work in and for Indian country, and this is one of the most important cases dealing with Indian law before the Supreme Court this year. So that's today in a nutshell.
Thanks.
Well, as an associate at Beveridge and Diamond, my day-to-day varies pretty often, and that's one of the things that attracted me to Beveridge and Diamond. For instance, as an associate at Beveridge and Diamond, you have a chance to try different practice areas because they want you to get exposed to various areas to see what you want to focus on and specialize in later down the road. So as an associate, for instance, primarily 80% of my workload involves around litigation, environmental litigation, but I can also get a phone call from a shareholder that's doing regulatory work that needs assistance with some Clean Air Act matters. That's also we have an international practice group that does a lot of international products regulation work, and you can get a call from a partner who may need assistance with looking at regulations in China for e-waste disposal. So there's a lot of different practice areas, and I think what I really enjoy about my work is that the firm will give you a chance to work on a practice area that's of interest to you. Primarily, I've done a lot of litigation, as I've mentioned, environmental litigation, dealing with toxic torts, biosolids, also, hazardous waste. So my day-to-day varies tremendously. Just today, I was preparing for depositions in a toxic tort case that I'm on right now. We have depositions coming up over the next few weeks, and so we're right now just going through and preparing for those. The next day, I'm working on a separate matter, an appellate brief for a case that we have in California dealing with biosolids. So it varies from day to day, which is what I really enjoy. Eventually, I think overall we do get a lot of interesting matters and interesting assignments on a day-to-day basis. You also get a chance to work on matters that are of interest to you. For instance, one thing that I like to monitor is different environmental justice matters throughout the country. There was an EJ panel recently back in, I want to say, April here in DC that I had a chance to assist with. They had various practitioners throughout from across the nation that came to DC and spoke on those topics, and a lot of the partners at the firm allowed me to do some research on that and prepare, actually do my partner's remarks for that actual conference. So my day-to-day varies. Like I said, primarily it's litigation. There's research and writing, or it could be from going to court and sitting in on various hearings. Also getting a chance to do a lot of pro bono work. I've taken the opportunity to do some pro bono work here in the city to get some experience in court and on my feet. But as far as in the environmental realm, I've also had a chance to work on e-waste matters. We monitor a lot of the state's e-waste regulations as they're put out, and we advise various clients on the regulations in each state and also internationally as far as what they can sell, how to dispose of that particular product or the actual waste within that country. So overall right now, as I continue to mention, it varies from day to day, but primarily litigation is where I'm at on the daily basis, and it's been an interesting ride so far. I've only been at the firm 2 years, but I feel like I've had a lot of great experience as far as working on appellate briefs. We had a chance to oppose a petition for cert in front of the California Supreme Court recently, when I had a chance to had the chance to work on that and actually draft the opposition. Also have had a chance to sit in on depositions. I haven't taken one yet, but I'm hoping to do that this summer, so to get some more experience on that end. But overall, it's been pretty interesting. I think you're kind of on the opposite side sometimes, but you try to work with the DOJ and the EPA to try to resolve certain issues together. And so it's been interesting. Sort of enjoyed the ride so far, and that's primarily how my day-to-day goes.
Thanks, Brandon.
So I really like this kind of day-in-the-life snapshot idea, so I'll try to riff on that a little bit and share with you a couple of things that I was doing earlier today before coming to be with you. Before I do that, and given that, as I mentioned in my earlier remarks, I think my model is a little bit, it's not a traditional legal practice model, so let me just say a couple more things about Meridian and what we do at Meridian. And I would encourage you, if you're interested, just to get a flavor for the kind of issues that are all rooted in natural resources, mostly rooted in natural resources, environment, sustainability kinds of issues, although we do some other things that are related to national security and things that might not be right in the sweet spot of environmental issues. It's really mostly rooted in sustainability. But if you want to take a look, go to merid.org, MERID.org, and you can see a good overview of projects and issue areas that we focus on. I mentioned that we're a nonprofit organization. We're a nonprofit that is here to bring collaborative problem solving to those kinds of tough issues, but we have a for-profit business model. So our work is driven by projects that are funded, that come to us as clients and partners that are either from the government, and that can be local, state, national, federal, international entities, from the private sector, from the business community, and from grants from private foundations. So roughly a third government, third private sector, third foundation is what supports the projects that we take up, and it's a fee-for-service, hourly work kind of business model. And the kinds of projects range in size and scope and scale from local, very specific, maybe watershed or community-based kinds of problems that are specific and discrete, to ongoing, large-scale, international and multi-dimensional kinds of projects. And the kinds of things that my colleagues focus on range from agriculture and food security, lots of work in Africa regarding value chains, supply chains for crops in Africa, community resiliency, forestry, climate change, biotechnology. There's a range. I focus most of my work on ocean policy, and I mentioned earlier that I, early in my career, had developed some interest and expertise in ocean policy and ocean and coastal management, and so the work that I do at Meridian is focused on that. So now, two little vignettes of things that I'm working on right now. In 2011, President Obama issued an executive order creating a national ocean policy. So, in other words, stating for the first time in U.S. law, via an executive order, that it is in the nation's interest, both economically and ecologically, to do our best to effectively manage ocean resources. And that executive order set up a structure for the federal government to better coordinate the multitude, 27 federal agencies that are charged with carrying out some aspect of ocean management or regulation, and to work with coastal states and tribes in coastal states that have, an interest and a stake and jurisdiction over those resources. One of the things that structure sets up is a mechanism for, on a regional basis, groups of states like the Gulf of Mexico, so the 5 Gulf states, or the 5 or 6 New England states or the Mid-Atlantic states, there are 9 regions, and these states working on a regional basis have an opportunity to work together with the tribes in that region and the federal agencies that have a presence in that region to try to identify regional priorities for their ocean space and their ocean resources that they want to work on together and better engage the federal government, leverage resources, and develop a planning approach that would enable them to look on an ecosystem basis instead of sector by sector, the way we traditionally manage these resources. So these entities, which are now in the early stages of being stood up or organized, are called regional planning bodies. There are 2 of them that are formalized right now, and others are coming online. One is called the Northeast Regional Planning Body, and the other is the Mid-Atlantic Regional Planning Body. Meridian, a team, myself and a team of my colleagues, is helping support the work of those regional planning bodies. So working with them in kind of a strategic advisory way to help them figure out how should they work with their citizens in that region as government representatives to identify common priorities and map out a strategy for addressing those priorities, challenges, opportunities. So earlier today, I spent time planning an agenda for a conference call that will be this group for the Mid-Atlantic that is trying to, in the first steps of doing this process. And we'll, continue on through the summer to where we'll go to a big public meeting and invite all of the interested citizens of the Mid-Atlantic to come and be part of a public meeting where this body will be discussing what they may identify as planning priorities and how they're going to proceed. So that's one thing that I did. Another thing that I did that's also related to the evolution and reform of ocean policy, national ocean policy, is I support an entity called the Joint Ocean Commission Initiative, which is the follow-up work of 2 blue ribbon expert ocean commissions, one that was created by Congress called the U.S. Commission on Ocean Policy, and one that was funded by the Pew Charitable Trust called the Pew Ocean Commission. Both of those groups did their work, issued reports about 10 years ago, and since then this joint follow-up effort has been trying to, be the keeper of the flame for that work. So both of those bodies were diverse, bipartisan, different kinds of expertise, which reached consensus on a set of recommendations about what the government, state, local, federal, should do to improve the way we manage resources. The joint initiative will be releasing its report, which it does periodically over the last almost 10 years, in a couple of weeks. It will be a report with a set of recommendations on what it thinks the Congress and the Obama administration can do from now to the end of this administration's second term to improve the way we manage ocean resources and improve the health of those resources for the economy and for the environment. So I'm working on finalizing that document and the strategy for publicly releasing that document and how we're going to get attention to that document by the people who need to take the actions. So those are 2 things that I've spent my time on today.
Great, thank you all for that great illustrative detail. We've gotten a set of questions that fit together from people listening on the phone, so I'll start off with those. They're specifically about decision points in career tracks going into law school and coming out of law school. The first one, and for the questions, anybody who has something to add can please jump in. How much did it matter for your career what school you chose to attend for law school? How do you think current law students will be affected by this in the changing modern legal scene, especially students who attend lower tier schools or environmental law specialty schools? So that's a question about, which school do you look at going in? And then 2, about coming out. What are the relative pros and cons of going straight into working for a nonprofit or public interest firm immediately after law school versus doing a clerkship for a year or 2? And this one is from a professor who says her students are very frustrated given the economy and the job market. and she asked for any advice about finding positions coming out of law school in this field. Brandon?
I'll chime in first. Addressing the question regarding what school to go to, we have attorneys from pretty much all tiers, and I think in today's with today's economy, one thing that we look at, I do some recruiting for the firm, and one thing we look at is whether or not you have a demonstrated interest in environmental law, and I think that's very key today. I mentioned earlier, whether or not you're involved in the clinic, whether or not you're on the Environmental Law Journal, the Environmental Law Society, have you taken courses in environmental law? I think a lot of employers today want to see, is this person interested in the work that we do, and do they really have an interest in environmental law? So I think that's one thing that's key for students, obviously doing well in law school, but also showing a demonstrated interest in environmental law. Addressing the other question as far as looking for jobs and to keep I think the big thing is to keep your options open. I think Dan mentioned earlier that there's a number of federal agencies that do environmental work. I just saw a posting the other day from the U.S. Postal Service is looking for an environmental attorney. People tend to not think out the box, but I think you have to do that. As you mentioned, pretty much all federal agencies need environmental lawyers. All major corporations need, in some shape or form, an environmental attorney. So I can say just keep your options open, whether or not you want to go private, to a nonprofit, or to government, or to corporate. Just keep your options open and think outside the box and explore the different opportunities that are out there.
Thanks.
It's hard to say this to people who have obviously spent a lot of time and money going to law school, getting a degree, studying for the bar, hopefully passing. But given the economy, and I can say this is with my own kind of shaky beginning of my career, I was really willing to, honest to God, work at a department store just so I could pay the rent. And I did a lot of interning with different companies to see if I could get my foot in the door for free. I was a little bit unusual in 1984 because I had this offer and then lost it, and needless to say, I'd never call National Reagan because I didn't like him, but for many reasons, not the least of which I lost my job. But I think it's hard to hear that you may be forced to do something that you think is kind of beneath you. I personally don't think waitressing is beneath anybody, but if it pays the rent and you have an opportunity to get your foot in the door and you can honestly say to somebody, I will work for free. I'm enthusiastic. I know how to do it. It's tiring. You end up working weekends and nights, and I'm not saying I wish it on anybody. I wish all of you get a job straight out of law school that you love. But if you can't, just don't be too picky. Realize you got to pay the rent, and realize that getting your foot in the door really may mean a lot. If you've got a good attitude and you can say, I understand it sounds crazy that I tell you I'm willing to work for free, but I am. And if they say to you, well, how are you going to pay the rent? I have a waitressing job 4 nights a week and on Saturdays and Sundays. Again, not fun, but I have a nephew graduating from law school next year, and he's going to a Tier 2 school, and he's been very realistic. He's from New York City, but he's going to SUNY Buffalo, and he's very realistic that he's probably going to be in Buffalo for a while to get experience. Again, I'll shut up now, but I just think you should just be a little flexible. You have to pay the rent, but you also should get your foot in the door. And in the environmental community, there are a lot of people who would need really bright young minds, but may not have the budget for it. So,
to hit on the question about the question about clerkships, as someone who didn't do one, I think there's a couple things. If you know you want to do more of like environmental policy kind of stuff, not necessarily straight legal, I'm not sure that a clerkship matters that much. If you know you want to be a lawyer and you want to do law, I think if you can get a clerkship, you should get one. I think they're very valuable. Many of my colleagues have all done clerkships. I think it's a great experience, and I think it stands out on a resume. I think it does mean something. So just the thought. I know they're competitive, and hey, look, I tried and I didn't get one. So, and I'm still here. So if you don't get one, don't you might cry. Don't worry about it. You'll move on. And the other thing so the other point I want to make with that is, especially if you know you want to do environmental work, there are a lot of opportunities that are sort of time limited right out of law school. One being, and this is not an endorsement, the Environmental Law Institute's fellowship program, Other environmental organizations have fellowship programs like it, 1 year, 2 years, and they may not pay great, but they're a great way to get your foot in the door. Like you said, if you can get one of these, and I know that these can also be fairly competitive as well, but great opportunity to at a place like ELI, you're going to get to work on projects where you are, the gopher or doing some of the yeoman's research for a project that involves federal agencies, international partners, corporations, foundations, environmental groups. You get to meet a lot of people really fast. So, and that would also be a plug for taking the no pay job if you can do it too, because that's what you're getting is that networking.
To the sort of suite of questions, I'd offer two biggish picture pieces of advice that go to a couple of the questions. One is, one of the best pieces of advice I got during law school was that law school was all about figuring out which hoop you're not going to jump through. And by that, I think that's important to think about. Are you going for law review or looking for a clerkship because everyone else is doing it, or because it's something that you think that you actually want to do? That goes to the second big picture piece of advice, which is whatever you're going to be doing, either in law school or after law school, try to work to put yourself in a position where you're doing something that you enjoy, or you enjoy at least some aspect of it. Because otherwise, if you're doing something because you want to just jump through that hoop and you fully expect you're not going to enjoy it, you're just going to put the grind through, you're not going to do as well. As opposed to if you're staring at an interesting, as the question asked, an interesting internship at a nonprofit that may well be one of those limited window internships versus a clerkship, don't automatically decide the clerkship is the better idea because it'll be good on my resume. Whereas, gee, I would love to do this work at this nonprofit. It has 6 different areas of work that I'm interested in doing. Give that some serious thought, because if you go in and do a good job because it's something that you enjoy and you won't enjoy every aspect of every job that you do, but it has some aspects that you enjoy, you are going to be successful at that position, and you'll get noticed, you'll make friends, you'll make colleagues, that can benefit you throughout the rest of your career. That's not to say don't do a clerkship, because Dan's exactly right. I didn't apply, so obviously I did not get a clerkship, and I recognize that it's something that a number of my colleagues at DOJ, as well as many of my colleagues in private practice, really benefited from and enjoyed, and it was helpful for their legal career, but it's not essential by any stretch of imagination. But if you could imagine yourself really enjoying spending a year or 2 years in that environment, getting to go behind the curtain in a way that 98% of you won't be able to do at any other point later on, because only a judge gets to go behind that curtain again. It's worth doing, but it's important to figure out, getting back to my first piece of advice, what hoop aren't you going to jump through? So, because sometimes by taking a pass on law review, you're able to focus on the Environmental Law Society and do a good job there, so that you've got friends and colleagues that from that experience that you can look to 5, 10, 15 years down the road.
Laura, did you have anything to add?
Well, I mean, I don't know that I have that much to add. One thing that Juge just said that struck me I wish I'd known then what I know now, is that the relationships that you build starting now will be valuable relationships to you throughout your career, no matter what you wind up doing with it. So I very much agree with the point about, think strategically about what you're passionate about and focus on that, and as opposed to doing something because you think you need to check the box, which is sort of my way of saying, jumping through the hoop or not. And the relationships that you will acquire along the way will pay off as you go through your career.
Great. I think now it would be great if we could see if there are any questions coming from the audience that's here with us today.
In the back? Just one moment for the microphone.
First brave soul.
I had a question for the government attorneys. Other than the honors programs, usually government jobs are looking for at least a couple years of experience. Could you describe or give advice as to what kind of experience would be good to get a job at the EPA or doing any kind of environmental work in the government?
Can I just repeat the question so it's for our people listening in? The question was for the government attorneys who are here. The questioner noticed that other than the honors programs, most government legal positions require some years of experience. So the question was, what types of experience would they recommend?
I'll jump in first, which is the maybe trite answer is good experience. And I actually mean that honestly, because there isn't, particularly as you've heard several times, there are all sorts of we'll focus on environmental, there are all sorts of environmental positions across the government, across the full suite of agencies, that all require different pieces of expertise and different experience and skill set. So if you're interested in finding a government position, don't pick the job that you're going to do next to prepare for that solely because you want the government position. Pick the job, once again, getting back to the same piece of advice, pick the job that if you have options, that you're going to do next because it's an interesting job and it's pretty much guaranteed to help prepare you for some government position that's out there doing something. So it's more important to focus on the work that you're going to be doing, and particularly right now in the current budget climate, it's not entirely clear how soon the government will be hiring. I know you guys are even more painfully aware of this than we are, but I will say I slipped in between hiring freezes after over a year sort of in limbo for this position. So I am aware that it's a tough hiring environment for the government and also in the private sector as well. So I don't envy you your position, but certainly focus on finding something interesting in the short term, and that should open doors for you in the long term.
And I'll be brief, but I agree with all of that. I think that's very good advice. And maybe to be a little bit concrete about my experience, and I'm not sure that it's all that helpful because I think like Juge, I kind of came in at a time where there was a quick spurt of hiring and then it ended, and now we are all being furloughed. So don't believe it when they say government's a reliable job. But my personal experience was a couple years here, and I was doing a couple of things. I was doing a work on a project on adaptation to climate change, which is sort of the policy domain of how we as a society or government respond to the impacts of climate change, rather than like how do we reduce our emissions. Now we have sea level rise and we have droughts and stuff like that. What do we do? And particularly kind of focused in the international and biodiversity areas. So working with developing countries, and Sandy is familiar with that project. Also did a project on federal energy subsidies, so was looking at, we did this investigation of sort of trying to just basically quantify the size of federal energy subsidies by fuel type, fossils, renewables, on down the line. And a couple of other projects. So I think that highlighting that kind of basically environmental interest, and then in my application, so I think that helped. And then in my, I think everybody does this. I think it's probably generally good practice when you're doing your application. Think about who you're applying to and how you word things, what your cover letter says, what types of experiences you have in your past that are relevant to that job. To the extent that you can do that, you can't always, but to the extent that you can. I think for EPA, I was trying to highlight the experience that I had with respect to regulation. Highlighted part of my law journal article on this aspect of Clean Air Act regulation, and doing some analysis of the preamble language and the sort of the really dry stuff that will bore most people to tears, and showing that I actually was interested in that was probably I think it was probably helpful. So that's just kind of my experience. And again, like Juge said, I think this, as you all are painfully aware, it's a difficult situation right now, and I'm not sure that my experience entirely translates.
Got one up here.
Thank you. This question is for Mary and Jude. Can you elaborate on your transition from in your case, the regulatory to counsel, and then in your case, a consultant to counsel? How you went about that, how you networked, and how did you end up where you are now?
Just
Well,
quickly.
mine is a pretty short story.
Let me recap just
Oh, that's
quickly.
right, I forgot, sorry.
The question was about how, specifically for Juge and for Mary, how they kind of switched sectors from private to government or consulting to private or whatever it may be.
Mine is mostly serendipity, honestly. I was working for a small firm in D.C. I started with an environmental consulting firm, then moved to a small law firm, and was doing kind of the same stuff in many respects. It was regulatory compliance work for businesses. I did a lot of work with pharmaceutical companies. There was a rise in that time period of a particular type of environmental insurance, and the main carrier of that insurance was AIG, actually, which seems weird today. And it's called environmental liability insurance, and they always needed what AIG required was environmental audits of the businesses that were applying for that insurance, and I was the lawyer who would go along on the audit. So I've been through many, many different types of plants in my life, in that small part of my career. I actually joined Lockheed because I needed a job because I was getting married and moving to Las Vegas. And they needed somebody who was an expert in environmental regulations, which my expertise was not great in 1990, but it was better than most of the other people who worked at the company. After about a year, the general counsel, who was in California, found out he had this rogue lawyer in Las Vegas, and he brought me into the legal department. And that was 1991, and I've been there ever since. And my practice has grown over the years. I've done a lot more litigation. I've done a lot of the Superfund work. Is a huge part of my job. The transactional work grew tremendously after September 11th. So it's more serendipity than anything else. I have a feeling that you have a better story. I really think I just was lucky, and I was in the right place at the right time. And the Lockheed and Martin Marietta merger was in 1995. My husband got out of the service, was graduating from graduate school. My dad had died. His father had died. We're both East Coast people. Neither one of us wanted to go back out west. And all of a sudden, Lockheed Martin, Lockheed had been headquartered in California, the new company was going to be headquartered in Bethesda, Maryland. And my husband had a job, and lo and behold, we were here. So it kind of worked out. I wish I could tell you that I was, but the one thing that has mattered is my ability to be flexible and to kind of take on whatever people hand me. And I've been lucky that it's been pretty interesting over the years. And honestly, just to work hard and have a really good attitude. Sometimes I feel like most of my career I'm winning the Miscongeniality Award versus like the Best Lawyer Award. But it doesn't really matter, because as long as you do a good service for your clients, as Dan talked about, and provide them advice, you're not always their friends. I mean, trust me, I've had run-ins many times with our Vice President for ESH. But but as long as you provide, good legal advice and can be a member of the team and know how to get along with people, you'll do well.
And I'll give an example of transitions that, not actually to my current position, but that highlight some of the other things that you can do, which is to make sure to think strategically about your networks and to maintain your networks of friends and colleagues. Actually, my my 1L summer position was at Natural Resources Defense Council, which was in part because I had one of my classmates in undergrad had done an internship there while we were out here at Stanford's program in Washington, D.C. And through her, I had met the person who was actually the hiring attorney and had a chance to interact while I was an undergrad, and a little bit thereafter while I was working here between undergrad and law school. And so I already had that little bit of a foot in the door through a little bit of serendipity and a little bit of intentional networking to the position for that 1L summer. And in maintaining my contacts at NRDC for that 1L summer, after law school, as I said, I worked at Perkins Coie in Oregon for 3 years. When we decided to move back to DC, actually, it's tough to imagine in this climate, but at that point, we actually moved back, and I didn't have a job, but I had some contacts and some ideas, and I wanted to focus on international environmental law work, which was one of the areas I'd focused on in law school. And through those contacts in NRDC, I was able to do some for one of them, I was able to do some consulting work for a time. That ultimately ended up in a law review article and resulted in another position, a temporary consulting position doing international environmental policy work, that through that network and that work that I was doing there was working in an area on issues that set me up quite well for the position at the Environmental Investigation Agency, because I was doing international environmental governance issues. And so it's important to both do good work and enjoy the work that you're doing, but also keep an eye open to your friends and the folks that you're working with, so that when it comes time to either make a leap or you're forced to make a leap, you've got a network of folks that you can draw on and ask, what do you know that's happening, what's happening out there, or can you set me up with an informational interview? I'm particularly interested in oceans policy, for example, and I was just on a panel with someone who does that professionally, and I could certainly see, given your interest, I'm sure that Laura would be up for spending a half an hour having coffee talking about the work that she does and, seeing where that goes.
Got one in the back.
Hi, thank you all for being here. I might be the only one in the audience that's not in law school or has a goal of becoming a legal professional. I'm doing a joint MBA and a PhD in environmental management, and I envision myself either in a corporate position or some sort of environmental consulting. I've taken a number of environmental and climate change law classes, but I was wondering if you had any other suggestions. I envision that regardless of the role I have, I'll be working a lot with lawyers, and so what other, aside from like something like this, or other suggestions might you have for kind of making sure that I am able to speak their language and understand their perspectives so that I can be most successful in the non-legal job that I ultimately hope someday I will have. Thank you.
This is fair. Oh, sorry. You have to repeat the question.
Sorry. Yeah. Let me just quickly. And there's actually one from the people on the phone that's similar. There are other non-legal people listening in. So the question was, this woman is pursuing an MBA and a PhD in environmental management, and she knows that ultimately she'll be interacting a lot with lawyers. So what's your advice for how to speak their language and work with them? And the person on the phone says she's about to graduate from Vermont Law School, but with an MA in environmental law and policy. And she asks, where do non-lawyers fit into the environmental law, employment, climate? What opportunities are there, particularly in the federal government?
I was just this is probably too personal, but my husband got an MBA, and one of the things that he was very thankful that he had was a couple of business law classes, and then he ended up actually being a TA he went to MIT for the business law professor, and from his perspective, that helped tremendously. Maybe just speak to me, I don't know, but he feels like it's helped tremendously in his career. That it gave him a sense. You're not going to pretend you're a lawyer. I know that, obviously, but you want to be able to speak the language, and he thought that was very helpful. But besides that, I can tell you the folks in our company who are the environmental safety and health professionals are extremely important, and they have your kind of background. We're happy when we get somebody with a PhD because it really means a lot. And they mostly are so good and smart, they don't really have to worry about speaking the language. I mean, we know how to talk to each other pretty well.
I would say find those lawyers who actually are halfway adept at speaking your language.
That's a really good point.
No, truly, because that's one of for the lawyers or proto-lawyers in the crowd, that's one of the things that you should strive towards, is recognizing that quite often, if you're doing your job, you are serving as a conduit or almost a translator service between your non-lawyer colleagues and a judge, the other folks in the general counsel's office. You are trying to help speak the language of the rest of the world and understand, and then also to be able to translate case law and regulations and statutes into an understandable piece of advice that will actually, if you're in-house, will actually be followed by your clients. I served, I was at Sidley effectively as in-house counsel for a major pharmaceutical company, and that was part of the role, is interacting with the EHS, the environmental health and safety folks, and making sure that you weren't giving the lawyer speak answer, and also that you weren't listening with your lawyer's ears, you were listening with your environmental tech ears to try to understand what the issue is. So once again, there are lots of niches for folks who have who end up doing, in some cases, what everyone else would describe as a lawyer's job of reading the regulations. If a regulation is well written, if Dan and his colleagues are doing their job, which they absolutely are. If a regulation is well written, statutes not so much. If a regulation is well written, with an eye to and working with folks in industry to design a niche app that will cover that industry, it is actually should be geared to be read not by the lawyers but by the environmental health and safety professionals and followed and understood. So that's.
Hear, hear.
Yeah,
I
it's
completely
radical
agree with
notion.
that. That's just a really, really important point. And by being a clear communicator, you're doing a great service to your colleagues, to your clients, and to the legal field and profession overall. So I think that's a very important point.
My question is for Brandon. Something that I keep hearing as someone who's not in law school yet is that the key to getting a job coming out of law school is to get either a summer internship or a summer associate position, specifically between your 2L and 3L year. And before, when you're talking about your short bio, you mentioned some summer positions, but if I remember correctly, neither were with Beveridge and Diamond. So more directly, I guess my question is, what led you coming out of law school to your job at Beveridge and Diamond?
Good question. I did not summer.
Oh, sorry. Need to recap. Very great pointed question for Brandon about the fact that the conventional advice is often that you need to spend the summer at the place that you ultimately end up working, and Brandon has managed to get a great job without going that route. So how did he do it?
Correct. As I mentioned earlier, I did a summer with the EPA one summer, and also another summer with the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. How did I attain my position at Beveridge and Diamond? Doing what you guys are doing today, going to different events, networking. Happened to meet someone from Beveridge and Diamond, and did coffee with them, learned more about the firm, the work that they did, and when trying to decide where I wanted to go after I graduated from law school, I did my homework, learned more about the firm, and ended up being brought in. And they liked the fact that I did work for the government for 2 summers, that I worked at the EPA, and the work that I did do, and found that as a valuable asset to the firm. So it was really about meeting the right people, getting out, networking, and not closing off my options, and just being open to different practice areas or different opportunities that are out there.
There's a question up here.
Hi, this is just a question for everyone generally. As an undergraduate, I think we're in an interesting position because law school might not be the best option right now, and I kind of have a 2-part question. One, were you considering anything other than law school? For any of you who knew that you wanted to do environmental work, if you were considering anything other than law school, what was it? And also, do you have advice about going straight from undergraduate to law school, or taking a break and having some work experience and giving yourself a break to prevent yourself from burning out, but also gaining some more experience and knowledge of what you should go back to school for?
We just got a very relevant question from someone who's still doing her undergraduate studies, looking for advice for people in undergrad about, well, first, just asking the panelists what they considered other than law, knowing that they wanted to do, if they knew that they wanted to do environmental work at that time, what did they consider other than law? And then, do they have any advice regarding the value of taking a break between college and law school?
I'll take the second part of that because I actually, I'm not saying this is right. I think generally you know nothing's right or wrong here, right? There are different paths. But I took a little over, well, I guess 1 year off between undergrad and law school, and it was time to do some traveling, and I held a couple of jobs, chance to get some life experience. I think taking time off between college and law school is incredibly valuable, and if I had to do it over again, I might have taken more time off, or tried to get more life and work experiences. I think the more you can get of that between undergrad and law school, the better. And I often find a lot of the most effective and talented colleagues that I have in the legal field are those who came to that from some significant either life experience or professional background experience. Like, if you're a student your whole life, or as a student for my whole life, I won't accuse anybody else, but I found it difficult to make the transition to an office environment, which is largely what you'll be doing in law. I mean, office environments are office environments. Knowing what an office environment is like, knowing what it means to have a boss, how to live in a white collar world. Those are kinds of like day-to-day, like practical how-to kind of stuff that I didn't really have, and I had to pick that up as quickly as possible from other people who did.
Mm-hmm. Laura?
Well, I'll chime in with a little bit of an alternative view. And as Dan said, these are all individual choices, and it really depends on your own, strengths and weaknesses. And while I think there can be a very valid case to be made, and I also have many colleagues who took time off or went back to law as a second profession, a second career, and have found it very useful to have taken time off. Depending on the kind of person you are, it may be better that you just, stay focused and power through, because if you take the time off, you may not ever get back. So, those are all individual choices that you have to evaluate given your own circumstances, your own needs, your own, feeling of burnout or potential burnout, or enthusiasm to just, like I said, power through and get it done. I think more to your other question, if I'm recalling it correctly, as someone who is not actually practicing law, I will say 100% that I consider it tremendously valuable and useful and a good investment for my future that I went to law school and have the training and the understanding of law and policy and how things really work, and that has served me well in several different settings, including in a traditional law firm, which I didn't mention, but I did do that very early on, just to validate that that wasn't really the right fit for me. I wanted to make sure that I knew that that was really, not the thing for me, and I was right. But so I'm someone who is very supportive of that and has, and I'm an example of someone who's done something that is different with a law degree, and there are, thousands of other variations on what you can do with a law degree, and I'm just one.
I know that we're probably supposed to be nice and touchy-feely, and so, but I'll go out on a limb and give an aggressive answer, which is if you're really not sure you want to go to law school or why you're going to law school, don't go at that point. It's because it's not it's a lot of work, and it is, and I love, it's expensive, and if you are only sort of figuring out why you're there your 3L year, it's, well, as the prior question highlighted about sort of tracking in law school and summer internships, and how, it used to be you could sort of take a gamble, your 1L summer internship, and then do a safe bet, your 2L, that would lead to at least an offer coming out. It's increasingly, you don't have that flexibility. So you are jumping into a 3-year commitment of time, energy, and if you don't know exactly why you're gonna, well, you don't have to know exactly why you're there, but if you're really uncertain about whether you should be there, whether this is what you want to do, not necessarily what you want to get out of it. Once again, sticking with my theme of, if you're doing something, do something that you enjoy at the time. It's perfectly okay to go to law school because you don't know what you want to do with your life, but you look forward to the academic environment and the back and forth and the debate, but you don't know whether you want to do litigation or compliance counseling or even practice. Perfectly okay to go to law school there, but if you're only going to law school because it's 3 years that you can kind of figure out whether you want to be there and what you want to do after, seriously reconsider and take some time. It can be incredibly helpful. I took a couple of years between undergrad and law school, and I'm still considering whether or not I wanted to go to law school all that time ago, and loved law school, loved the practice of law, but having that time to really know what it was, and I in fact deferred for a year because I was enjoying the work that I was doing at my job between undergrad and law school, and I felt that really helped prepare me to have an effective 3 years at law school. But it is all individual choices, and I'll get back to the touchy-feely answer, which is you need to figure out what's sort of best for you. But if you want a hardcore piece of advice, that I'll try and put that stake in the ground. Don't go unless you have at least some reason why you think you're going.
Just to quickly add on to that, when I figured out that environment was what I wanted to do in college, because I love backpacking, I love being outdoors, I loved ecology, I loved all the stuff that gets you outside and in the field and doing and enjoying the environment. And you get to law school and you realize that is not exactly what environmental law is about.
I mean, you're not going to see the environment.
Yeah, right.
I live in a windowless office. It's really frightening, actually.
And if you end up seeing the environment, it's often the environment of facilities that smoke and leak and
That's right.
spill
Yeah.
and explode.
Absolutely. And when you're in law school, you're like, at Vermont even, they follow the core curriculum for the first year, so it's like contracts, torts, it's all this stuff. It's like, they get you in with, the flowers and the trees and the bees, and then suddenly you're reading, Learned Hand and, these ancient old dead men, but what I was going to say to that is, if there was a part of me that also loved that part of it. And so if you're into the environmental law because you really want to be outdoors and you really care about doing that, which I do, but I don't get to do that. But if that's what you are and that's who you are, then you should go find a way to do that and be in the environmental field and be effective there. Because I think the law is also going to be something that appeals to folks who. So I was like a philosophy major and like arcane abstract thoughts and arguments and logic and that sort of stuff that bores other people to tears. So if you, I think that environmental law for me it seems like a good fit because I kind of like both things. I like that I'm working on behalf, working to protect the environment I love, but I also can stomach the day-to-day of statutory analysis.
The birds and the bees appeal to you, as does the inner environmental geek.
Yeah, exactly.
Part of it.
Yeah.
Did I see a hand over here? Yeah.
Staying on the experience topic, I'm a third-year evening student going into my third year now. I have a full-time job, a family, and so I'm wondering if you can maybe give a little perspective on what employers see. I may not have the opportunity to do the summer internships, the fellowships to get that sort of day-to-day legal experience. I do have the benefit of working in the policy side of the field. So I'm wondering sort of, from your perspectives, how do you see that when you're, looking at a resume for someone applying for a legal job? And do you have any advice in my academic career where I should try to focus?
We just got a question from someone who's entering his third year doing law school in the evenings while also holding down a full-time job, and I applaud you for that.
Don't forget the family.
And
Yeah,
yes,
the family, right.
and with a family. And the question is, he doesn't have the opportunity to do necessarily internships or take summer positions, so what kinds of things can he do to build his resume, and what are employers looking for besides internships? And there's a related question from somebody listening in. She was specifically addressing it to Mary, but I think others might have comments on this. And this woman says she's particularly interested in working directly with private companies, she says, on proactive environmental compliance. So what do you recommend? Do you recommend focusing on coursework or other experiences, particularly relating to general corporate law?
I was actually going to answer your question. I think I can answer both. We normally don't hire straight out of law school. We normally require anywhere between 5 and 7 to 8 years experience, mostly at a law firm or at EPA or, but with somebody like you, and I'm right now for the woman in the audience, I'm looking at the gentleman who asked the question. You may want to apply to some companies. Having actual real world, to Dan's point, experience for 4 years. First of all, it looks really impressive that you're doing this in 4 years with a job and a family, and that means something to employers. Second of all, from my company's perspective, your life experience may supplant the fact that you don't have law firm experience. So I think you should be able to cast your net wider. If the woman on the phone's question, if you don't have a lot of the life experience that the gentleman in the audience does, you would need to get some, at least from my company, most companies are like this. We're not a training firm for the most part, not to denigrate, obviously, law firms or government agencies, but we expect people to kind of hit the ground running. If you've had some experience that seems relevant to, for example, an environmental safety and health legal group, you should send your resume. You may get a bite because it's that kind of level of experience, again, may supplant what we normally look for. We try to be a little less rigid than we appear sometimes. So it's worth casting your net wide. And for the woman on the phone, I just would recommend that you get a little bit of experience from my perspective. just because it's a little hard for us to hire straight out of law school.
But the corporate law, academic work, corporate
Right.
law, bankruptcy,
Absolutely.
corporations, these are things that anyone who's interested in environmental law should consider taking, because
That's a good point.
you will be dealing with, in most cases, figuring out the corporate form and how the corporations fit together, and the parent company and the relationship, and how the liability flows. And if you don't have an academic grounding in that, you're going to have to do some quick study to try and figure out some of those issues. And bankruptcy is another area where you can provide some real value added if you understand some of those issues as well. So it's certainly worth considering. Another area that folks may get advice but may not have listened to it is administrative law.
Oh, yeah.
Take your admin law class, because it's incredibly important to the way that the environmental laws work.
It is environmental law.
It is environmental,
Yeah,
yeah, exactly. It's the
Any other questions? Well, I would like to thank our panel for a really great discussion. I hope it was valuable to all of you, and I hope that many of you can stay around, because we'll be breaking down the room, but then we'll be having a reception starting at 5. So thank you.
So thanks to